Look around the room you are in right now. The walls, the ceiling, the pipes behind them. There is a good chance that somewhere near you, hidden inside the building itself, is a material that has been quietly waiting for decades. A material that, if disturbed, releases fibers so small you would never see them, never feel them, never know you had breathed them in. And then it waits. 20 years. 30. 40. Until one day, long after you have forgotten you were ever near it, it becomes a cancer that has no cure. It was called the magic mineral. For most of the 20th century, it was a miracle. Cheap, fireproof, in almost everything humans built. The company that sold more of it than anyone knew exactly what it was doing to people. They had the medical proof. They read it. They discussed it in writing. And they decided that the safest thing to do was to say nothing at all. To understand this story, you have to understand how much the world loved asbestos. It is a natural mineral, pulled from the ground, that can be fluffed apart into soft, silky fibers. And those fibers have an almost magical property. They do not burn. They resist heat, acid, electricity, and time itself. Humans noticed this thousands of years ago. The ancient world wove it into cloth that could be thrown into fire and pulled out clean. They called it the magic mineral, but it was the 20th century that truly fell in love. As cities filled with electricity and machines and fire hazards, asbestos became the answer to everything. It insulated pipes and furnaces, it fireproofed steel and ships and skyscrapers. It went into brake pads, floor tiles, roof shingles, cement, even toothpaste and fake snow. It was everywhere. It was in the walls of schools and hospitals and homes. And at the center of this empire stood one company, bigger than all the rest. Its name was Johns-Manville. By the middle of the century, Johns-Manville was the largest asbestos company on Earth. It mined the mineral, it milled it, it manufactured thousands of products from it, and it sold them to a world that could not get enough. It employed tens of thousands of people. Miners who dug the rock out of the ground. Factory workers who fed it into machines. Men who spent their days inside clouds of fine gray dust so thick that, in some plants, you could barely see the person next to you. The work was hard, but it was steady. It fed families. It built lives. To the men on the factory floor, Johns-Manville was not a villain. It was the company that put food on the table. They breathed that dust every day, for years, and thought nothing of it. Why would they? No one had told them there was anything to fear. But high up in the company, someone already knew. The first warnings did not come from an enemy of the industry. They came from inside it. By the 1930s, doctors were beginning to notice a pattern among asbestos workers. Men in their 30s and 40s, far too young, growing short of breath. Their lungs slowly stiffening, scarring, hardening, until breathing itself became a struggle, and then, for some, impossible. The disease got a name, asbestosis, a slow suffocation, caused by years of breathing the dust. It was not subtle. Workers were getting sick. Workers were dying. And the companies that employed them were paying close attention. Not to protect the men, but to understand exactly what they were dealing with, and how much it might cost them. Because here is the thing about asbestos disease. It is slow. The damage takes years, even decades to appear. Which meant a company could keep a man working, productive, and profitable for a very long time before the bill for his lungs ever came due. So the industry did something chilling. It studied its own workers and kept what it learned to itself. Companies ran medical exams. They took chest x-rays. They watched the disease spread through their workforce in real time. And when the results came back showing early signs of asbestosis, they faced a choice: tell the men or don't. At Johns-Manville, the answer was written down. In 1949, the company's own physician, Dr. Kenneth Smith, examined a group of workers whose X-rays showed the early shadows of asbestosis in their lungs. He advised the company not to tell them. His reasoning, in his own words, was that as long as a man was not yet disabled, he should not be told of his condition, so that he could, quote, live and work in peace, and the company could benefit from his years of experience. Let that settle for a moment. A doctor, looking at the scarred lungs of working men, recommending that they be kept in the dark about their own bodies, so the company could get a few more good years of labor out of them before they fell ill. And the man who ran Johns-Manville did not fire that doctor for suggesting it. He promoted him. Dr. Smith would go on to become the company's medical director. None of this was an accident. It was policy. And we know that, because they wrote it down. And one day, those writings would be found. Go back to 1935. Two of the most powerful men in the asbestos industry were exchanging letters. One was Sumner Simpson, president of a company called Asbestos Manhattan. The other was Vandiver Brown, an executive and attorney at Johns-Manville. The medical evidence about asbestos was piling up. A trade magazine wanted to publish articles about the dangers, and these two men discussed, in writing, what to do about it. Simpson's view was simple. He wrote that, in his opinion, the less said about asbestos, the better off we are. And Brown, at Johns-Manville, agreed. He wrote back that the best approach was to make sure the subject of asbestosis received the absolute minimum of publicity. The less said, the better off we are. Not the workers. Them. But the coldest moment of all was not written in a letter. It was spoken out loud, in a meeting, and remembered, decades later, by a man who was in the room. His name was Charles Romer, an official from another asbestos company. He described a meeting in the early 1940s with the leadership of Johns-Manville, including its president, Louis Brown. They were discussing the medical findings, the evidence that the dust was destroying men's lungs. And Romer, by his account, asked Brown a direct question. Do you mean to tell me you would let these men keep working, knowing they would get sick and die? And Louis Brown, president of the largest asbestos company on earth, gave an answer that Romer never forgot. Yes, he said, we save a lot of money that way. There it is. Not a slip, not a misunderstanding. A calculation. The lungs of thousands of workers, weighed against a balance sheet, and found to be the cheaper option. Mammoth 19. Paranster. And so, for decades, the machine simply kept running. The miners kept mining. The factory workers kept breathing the dust. New products kept pouring out into the world, into the walls of new schools, new hospitals, new homes. Millions of tons of it, woven into the fabric of modern life. Between roughly 1940 and 1980, an estimated 27 million American workers were exposed to asbestos on the job. Around the world, the number reaches into the hundreds of millions. And almost none of them were ever warned. They handled it with bare hands. They ate their lunches in the dust. They carried it home on their clothes, where it settled onto the laps of their wives who did the laundry, and their children who ran to greet them at the door. The men who knew watched it happen. Quarter after quarter, year after year. The profits were extraordinary. the secret held. For a while. Because a poison like asbestos keeps its own kind of records. It does not act quickly, the way a bullet does. It writes its verdict slowly, inside the human body, over 20, 30, 40 years. Every man who breathed that dust was carrying a clock. He could not hear ticking. And when those clocks finally began to go off, all at once, across an entire generation, the truth that Johns-Manville had worked so hard to bury was going to come clawing its way back to the surface. The men who were never told were about to start dying, in numbers no company could hide. And someone was going to find the letters. For years, the medical truth about asbestos stayed scattered. A study here, a case there, easy for a powerful industry to wave away. Then came a doctor named Irving Selikoff. Working at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York in the early 1960s, Selikoff studied asbestos workers in large numbers, carefully, rigorously. And what he found could no longer be waved away. He confirmed, beyond serious doubt, that asbestos did not just cause asbestosis. It caused cancer, lung cancer, and something rarer and even more terrible. It is called mesothelioma. It is a cancer of the thin lining around the lungs and other organs. And it is almost unique in the world of disease, because it has essentially one cause: asbestos. If you are diagnosed with mesothelioma, a doctor can say, with rare certainty, where it came from. Somewhere in your past, often decades in your past, you breathed asbestos fibers. Maybe at work. Maybe from a parent's dusty clothes. Maybe from a wall in a building you never thought twice about. And that is the cruelest part. Mesothelioma hides. The fibers lodge in the body and do nothing for 20, 30, 40 years. The exposure is long forgotten by the time the cancer appears. And once it appears, there is still, to this day, no cure. A man could have breathed that dust as a young worker in the 1950s, and been killed by it as an old man in the 1990s, wondering where on earth it had come from. Selikoff's work made the danger undeniable, and it lit the fuse on the largest wave of lawsuits in American history. As the sick and the dying began to sue, their lawyers went looking for one thing: proof of what the companies had known, and when they had known it. For a long time, the industry insisted it simply hadn't understood the risks in time. That it was all a tragic accident of incomplete science. And then the documents came out. The most damning of all were discovered in the personal files of Sumner Simpson, the very letters from the 1930s. The correspondence agreeing that the less said about asbestos, the better. Decades of internal memos, medical reports, and quiet decisions, all preserved. They became known as the Sumner-Simpson Papers. Here, in black and white, was the answer. The companies had not been confused, they had not been in the dark. They had known, for decades, and had made a deliberate choice to keep their own workers, and the public, from finding out. The tragic accident defense collapsed. What was left was something much closer to a crime. What followed became the largest personal injury litigation in the history of the United States. Hundreds of thousands of people filed claims. Workers with scarred lungs. Widows of men who had died gasping for air. People with mesothelioma who had never worked in a factory in their lives, who had simply lived in the wrong building, or hugged the wrong father when he came home covered in dust. The lawsuits came in a flood that no company could survive intact. And so, in 1982, Johns-Manville did something extraordinary. It declared bankruptcy. But Johns-Manville was not broke. It was, by most measures, still a profitable company. The bankruptcy was a strategy. By filing for Chapter 11 protection, the company could freeze the tidal wave of lawsuits, stop the claims piling up against it, and force everything into a single, controlled process, on far more favorable terms than facing every victim, one by one, in open court. Out of that process came the Manville Trust, a fund set up to compensate the victims. Over the years, it has paid out more than $4 billion to people harmed by the company's asbestos. $4 billion sounds like justice. But spread across hundreds of thousands of victims, many claims are paid at pennies on the dollar. And no fund, of any size, can give a person back their lungs, or return a father to the children who watched him suffocate. The company that had counted on the disease being slow had, in the end, been right. It was slow enough that by the time the truth arrived, the men who made the decisions were mostly gone. You might assume this is a story about the past, a 20th century horror, safely behind us. It is not. Because of that long latency, asbestos is still killing people today, on a massive scale. Around the world, more than 200,000 people are estimated to die every single year from asbestos-related diseases. The overwhelming majority of those deaths come from exposure at work. These are not old cases from a bygone era. Many are people who were exposed years or decades ago, whose clocks are only now going off. The peak of the dying, in many countries, is happening in our lifetime. And here is the fact that stuns most people when they first hear it. In the United States, the country at the very center of this story, asbestos has never been fully banned. For decades, efforts to ban it were fought, watered down, and defeated. It was not until 2024 that American regulators finally moved to ban the most common form still in use. And even that rule was immediately challenged in court by industry interests, its future thrown into doubt. Meanwhile, the magic mineral is still there. It is still sitting inside millions of older buildings. Schools your children may attend. Homes people live in, pipes and ceilings and floors all over the world. As long as it is left undisturbed, it waits. And every renovation, every demolition, every crack in an old wall risks letting it loose again. The fibers do not expire. The clock never really stops. So this is not a story about a poison no one understood. The men who ran Johns-Manville were not confused. They were not waiting for the science. They had the medical reports on their desks. They had the x-rays of their own workers' ruined lungs. They wrote to each other that the less said, the better. They chose not to warn the people breathing their dust, and, by one account, said plainly that letting those people work themselves to death saved money. They were right about the money. For a very long time, the silence paid. But the mineral kept its own accounts, and it is still settling them, in cancer wards, in the lungs of people who never knew they were at risk. More than 200,000 of them every year, all over the world. The magic mineral was never really magic. It was only patient. And so were the men who sold it, knowing exactly what it would do, and deciding, again and again, that the truth was simply too expensive to tell.